of evolution, but why did this evolve? Excuse me?
They can move faster.
Exactly. If you think about what they're doing, they're digging through the dirt. They're trying to push their way through the soil. I have a hard enough time digging a hole in the dirt here with a shovel. Imagine just trying to push your way through with your head. So as they're pushing their way through, if they have extraneous features, if they have body parts sticking out, lots of hairs, fleshy leg-like structures, what is that going to do? That's going to make it more difficult to move through the soil. So they've evolved this body shape because of their habitat, because of how they move around. Now, unlike the polychaetes, here the earthworms are hermaphroditic, meaning that an individual contains both the male and the female reproductive organs. But even though they are hermaphroditic, they will they will still cross-fertilize. So it's sort of the same idea as the plants. Plants can contain both male and female reproductive organs, but they will still cross-fertilize with each other. Now, oftentimes when we think about the earthworms, we don't think about a very closely related organism in the same class. These are the leeches. So if you see a leech, it's basically the same thing as an earthworm. Now we move on to two different other phyla of organisms that are grouped collectively called the Lophophorians. The Lophophorians are primarily marine in nature. There are a few terrestrial examples, a few freshwater examples, but really we're talking about marine organisms here. These two phyla are the Bryozoa and the Brachiopoda. Both of these are characterized by a structure that's referred to as the lophophore. The lophophore is either a circular or a U-shaped structure. It surrounds the mouth, and it has usually one or two rows of tentacles, basically ciliated tentacles that help increase water flow, help move the water with food items towards the mouth structure. So both the Bryozoa and the Brachiopoda have this structure. It also functions in gas exchange in addition to feeding. Now, both these phyla have this lophophore structure. There's still a lot of question about how both of these evolved this characteristic. Was it because of a common ancestor, or was it because of convergent evolution? Remember, convergent evolution is where you see a similar characteristic in two unrelated lineages. Because they live in the same environment, they develop similar traits. So there's sort of a question about the phylogeny. The phylogeny is still a puzzle with these two. We don't know exactly where they fit on this phylogenetic tree. So if you look at these two phylum, we have the Brachiopoda here, or the Brachiopoda, where are they? Well, there's the Brachiopoda, there's the Brachiopoda, there's the Bryozoa right there. So we do group them close to each other, but it's uncertain if that's accurate. Now, the Bryozoa are also sometimes referred to as ectoprocta or moss animals. They don't actually live in moss. Often, if you see them referred to as moss animals, you might think they're found living in a mossy environment. But they're actually referred to moss animals because of their structure. People initially thought they looked sort of like moss. They're very small. They usually live in colonies. And when the individuals are growing, they secrete basically the same kind of structure as a shell. They have a chamber that's called the zooecium that is attached to the substrate, and they live inside that chamber. So it sort of serves the same purpose as some of the shells that we saw with the mollusks. Now, they've also made, in addition to this chitinous chamber, they can also secrete a calcium carbonate, and this actually sometimes helps build coral reefs. Now, with the Bryozoa, they often engage in asexual reproduction. They're capable of budding, where you have a smaller organism growing from the larger one, and it breaks off and can become an entirely new organism. So this is asexual reproduction. It's not through sexual recombination or fertilization. The offspring that are produced are going to be genetically identical to the parents. So this is what they look like. You can see the shell-like structure that they are found, that they grow in. They live inside this. They can use their muscle to pull themselves in or out. And when they're extended, they engage in the breathing and the feeding, so they have this lophophore that extends out, filtering material out of the water. Very simple animal, but still an animal. This is what one looks like. You can sort of maybe see a little bit why they thought it looked a little bit like moss. Now, the Brachiopoda look very different. And this is one of the reasons why people aren't sure how they're related to each other. Even though they have this same lophophore, physically they appear very different. They, in fact, look much more similar to clams or mussels. The brachiopods are sometimes referred to as lamp shells. They have a two-calcified shell structure. So they still release a shell-like structure just like the bryozoa, but it's not attached to the substrate. It's actually a bivalve-like structure where you have two sides. The difference is the bivalves split the shell laterally, where they split into left and right. The Brachiopoda split into or laterally where you split it into left and right. The Brachiopoda split it horizontally where you have a dorsal and a ventral shell. So it's similar, but again, it's not exactly the same. With the Brachiopoda, the lophophore is inside the shell. It doesn't extend out like we see with the bryozoa. So now we move on to the next phylum of coelomated invertebrates, the phylum Arthropoda. If you think about the success of animals, how can you measure success? Reproduction. What is reproduction going to lead to? More of them. So you can measure success by the number of animals. If you use the number of animals as a measure of success, just how many there are on the planet, the phylum Arthropoda is by far the most successful lineage. There are more numbers of arthropods, simply living arthropods on the planet than any other phylum of animal. Maybe you measure success by diversity. There are more kinds of arthropods than there are in any other phylum on the planet. So when you talk about success, if you look at simply things in terms of biological success, how many there are, how many different kinds there are, arthropods are the most successful of all animals that are found on the planet. There are well over 1 million different kinds of species. Basically, 2/3 of all species of animals that we know are arthropods. So 2/3 of everything that we can think about are arthropods. Arthropods do have an impact on human life. They cause disease, they're beneficial, they are crop pests, so they can be both harmful and helpful for human activity. And all arthropods that are alive today, there are some extinct lineages, are broken down into one of 4 classes. You have the chelicerates, the crustaceans, the hexapods, and the myriapods. So if we sort of look at these 4 different classes and look at the lineages within arthropods, we have the chelicerata, these include the spiders and the mites. We have the crustaceans, those are the ones that are good to eat. We have the hexapods, these include the insects. And we have the myriapods, these are the multiple-legged ones, the centipedes and the millipedes. And if you look at the diversity of arthropods, what do the vast majority of these arthropods consist of? Of those classes, which one is the largest class? Hexapods. Beetles aren't a class, but they're within the class Hexapoda. They're insects. So if you look at this, you have the hexapods, which account for 36% of all living arthropods. 12% are the flies. 12% are the butterflies. About 10% are the wasps, ants, and bees. And about 8% are other insects. So overall, if we talk about 2/3 of all animals on the planet being arthropods, approximately 2/3 of all arthropods are insects. So the most successful lineage of the arthropods are the insects. Now, why are they so successful? What is it about arthropods that make them able to survive in so many different kinds of environments? Part of this is because they show segmentation. Just like we saw with the annelids, their body is broken down into repeated units, and you can break the arthropod body down into different subunits. Generalized, the arthropod body is going to have a head region, it's going to have a thorax region, and then it's going to have an abdominal region. And the abdominal region, in many cases, is broken down into further segments. So the segmentation, the specialization that can occur when you have these repeated units is one of the reasons for success. Another reason for success is because of the exoskeleton. This is the first lineage of organisms that really evolved any sort of skeletal structure. Now, it's not an internal skeleton like we think about with vertebrates. It's an exoskeleton. It's a skeletal structure that's found on the outside, but it serves many of the same purposes, and in some ways, it's even better than an internal skeleton. In some ways, it's not better. It's made of chitin, not like the calcium that we see in our bone structure. So chitin and protein is what the exoskeleton is made of. One of the reasons why it can be considered better than an internal skeleton is because it protects from water loss. You have a surrounding layer of cells, a surrounding impenetrable barrier that's going to prevent water loss. Does our skeleton help prevent water loss? No. We have this soft, fleshy stuff on the outside. It doesn't really help as well as an exoskeleton. It helps serve for protection and protecting the body. Our exoskeleton does, or our endoskeleton does do that. It helps serve with locomotion, same thing as our endoskeleton. The difference in one of the benefits that it provides is protecting against this water loss. But the detriment to having an external skeleton is the skeletal structure of the exoskeleton cannot increase in size. So what that means is as an arthropod grows, it has to molt the exoskeleton. It undergoes a process that's referred to as ecdysis, molting or losing of the exoskeleton. The exoskeleton breaks apart. The organism crawls out from inside the exoskeleton, and it usually will then have a soft exoskeleton that will then harden into a larger structure. So that's one of the detriments to having an exoskeleton. You're limited in size based on this exoskeleton, and it's more difficult, more tedious of a process to grow larger. Now, in addition to the exoskeleton, in addition to the segmentation, arthropods are the first lineage to have jointed appendages. They have appendages that can do this or this. They can bend, they can flex. And this allows for very precise movement. When you have a jointed appendage, you can control the movement at a very detailed level. If you look at what arthropods are capable of doing, flying. Do we have non-jointed appendages to organisms that can fly? No, because flying requires very detailed control of the appendages. And so you can do that with these jointed appendages. Now, jointed appendages in arthropods have also been modified. Some of the antennae, the sensory structures, are basically modified legs in arthropods, but so are the mouth parts. The mouth parts that we see in arthropods are usually bilaterally symmetric. There's going to be a right side and a left side, and basically those have become modified legs that are now used for feeding. In arthropods, we also start to see the evolution of more advanced organ systems. Now, they have a circulatory system. It's this open circulatory system, just like we saw with the mollusks, but they still have a heart, they still have hemolymph that flows through, so they do have a circulatory system. They have a more advanced nervous system. They don't just have an increased ganglia, they actually have a brain structure and more advanced neural networks throughout their entire system. So they have this double chain of segmented ganglia that allows for more efficient communication, more rapid movement. The ventral ganglia, if it's double-sided, they have a dorsal and a ventral ganglia. The ventral ganglia is actually what is in control of most activities in the arthropod. And what this means is you can actually remove their head where their brain is found. They can still eat, they can still move, they can still copulate. The brain portion of the nervous system is primarily used for sensory control, receiving information about the external environment. The physiological control is primarily occurring in the dorsal ganglia. Arthropods have very advanced eyes. They're referred to as compound eyes. Many species of arthropods have very precise visual acuity. They can see colors, in some cases more colors than we can see. They can have very easy detection of movement. And the reason for this is because their eyes are actually made up of multiple individual visual units. There are multiple units in most insect eyes that are receiving visual stimuli. We've all seen those pictures where they show us this is what a fly sees, and you see all the little TV screens or something. That's because that's what the image of each of these visual units that's referred to as an ommatidia is receiving. So that because they are getting so much information, their visual acuity is very high. Now, not all arthropods have these highly developed eyes called complex eyes. Some of them have relatively simple eyes that are referred to as ocelli. Ocelli usually can basically just detect light and dark, maybe a little bit of movement, but they're not going to be very good at detecting detailed movement, small movement, or colors. So usually those are found in immature arthropods or arthropods that do not rely on vision very much. There are some arthropods that actually have both ocelli and the ommatidia. There are some beetles that live in aquatic environments, and they have a pair of ocelli that might be located on the top, and they have ommatidia that might be located on the bottom as they swim around at the surface of the water. Why would you want two pairs of eyes?
So they won't get you.
What will get you?
The birds, like they say, when you take the dark
Birds. Those might be coming in from the top. And if you're coming in from the top, oftentimes you're going to be casting a shadow. You might not need very good visual acuity, just sort of a light and dark. If you see it suddenly turning dark, you know something's right over you, you start diving down to swim down. So that explains why they have the eyes on the top. What about from the bottom?
The organisms better in the water?
See if something's coming to get you from the water. There are many, many predators that live in the water. If you just have one pair of eyes, you might be sort of limited to where you're looking. So some of these have multiple pairs of eyes. This is what the compound eye, the complex eye looks like. You can see it's made up of these individual ommatidia that have the corneal lens. These each are able to receive visual input, and the compound eye is made up of many of these put together. It's an entirely different kind of visual structure than we see in vertebrates. They have a relatively advanced respiratory system. Many aquatic arthropods have a respiratory system that has evolved gills, more efficient extraction of oxygen from the water. Some very small arthropods actually lack respiratory organs because if you're very small, you can just diffuse gas material in. But most arthropods, especially the larger ones that are terrestrial, use trachea. So they have basically some sort of rudimentary system that would be the same kind of thing as lungs. They breathe oxygen in, it breaks down into smaller and smaller tracheoles, so then the oxygen can directly diffuse and come in contact with the cells. So that's the same idea as how our lungs work. So the way that these trachea are attached to the environment, because remember you have the exoskeleton that's blocking off the organ structures, is there are holes in the exoskeleton that are referred to as spiracles. The spiracles have valves, just like we talked about with the stomata in plants. If the spiracles are open, you're losing water. So they need to be able to open and close. So there's valves that are found on the spiracles to control water loss. Now, spiders are among the arthropods that have the most advanced respiratory systems. Their respiratory organs are much more similar. They still have these trachea and the tracheoles, but they're very similar to advanced lung systems that we see in mammals and vertebrates. So this is sort of what it looks like. You have an arthropod here. You have the spiracles where you have the openings to the external environment. If you look at the trachea themselves, it's basically these tubes where you can breathe in, inhale gases. They break down into smaller and smaller tubes called tracheoles until eventually you have this gas exchange occurring. So let's go through these different classes, starting with the Chelicerata. These include the spiders, ticks, mites, scorpions, daddy longlegs, horseshoe crabs, and sea spiders. These are not insects. Before today, how many people thought a spider was an insect or a scorpion was an insect? It's okay, be honest. Lots of people do. So you now learn something today. You can go around and tell someone, I learned something in biology class, believe it or not. So these are not insects because of similarities and because insects are the most common of all arthropods. A lot of people think that basically all arthropods are insects. But insects are simply one of the classes. The Chelicerata, all these spiders, ticks, mites, and so forth, are recognized by appendages they have on their anterior portion that are referred to as chelicerae. All Chelicerata have these. They're adapted to a variety of functions. Usually they serve as either the fang-like structures we see on spiders or pinchers like that we might see on the horseshoe crabs. But they're found only on the Chelicerata, not on other arthropods. Now, if you recall with the arthropods, we said there's a head, a thorax, and an abdomen region. The Chelicerata bodies are only divided into two body regions. You have an anterior prosoma region. This is where all the appendages, the legs, are going to be found. You have pedipalps, and all the chelicerates have 4 pairs of legs. So when you see something like a scorpion, those big claws are the chelicera. Those are not considered legs. So that you have that anterior region in the Chelicerata. You also have a posterior region that's called the opistoma. These contain the reproductive regions. Within the chelicera, you have the Uraniae. These are the spiders. There's about 35,000 different species. These are very important predators. For anybody who doesn't like spiders, you should be actually getting down on your hands and knees and saying thank you to all the spiders you know. Because without spiders, there would be so many more insects, especially pest species, out there. It would basically be unbearable. The spiders are a huge predator of insects. Without them, you'd have many more mosquitoes, gnats, all the fun insects that we love so much. Now, many spiders, as we know, have sort of silk. They create a web-like structure. Some of them create a web that's permanent. Some of them create temporary webs. There are even some that create like nets out of webs and use those nets to catch prey items. The silk is produced out of spinnerets that are found on the anterior end or the posterior end of the spider. It's found on the abdomen, and basically this silk structure, we have not been able to replicate it in laboratory conditions. It's among the strongest structures that's able to be made. Now, some of the spiders, as we mentioned, make these webs and sit and wait. Others actively hunt their prey. Anyone here seen a tarantula around? We have a lot of native tarantulas in this area. Now? When it rains? They go out and they're actively hunting prey. They don't sit there and make a web and wait for the prey to come to them. The tarantulas are going to be one of these spiders that are active hunters. Now, all spiders have venom glands. All spiders produce a venom that can be channeled through their fangs, through their chelicera. The difference is the venom varies in toxicity. There are really only four families of spider that are found in the world that have a venom that is toxic enough to kill humans. Very few spiders overall have a venom that is strong enough. There are only two kinds of spiders, two families of spiders that are found in the U.S. that have a venom that is strong enough. Anyone know what those are? Black widows are one of them. There are multiple species of black widow. They have a venom that's strong enough. The brown recluse is the other one. There's multiple species of brown recluse. Those are the only two that have a venom that's strong enough. Now, I'm not saying if you get bitten by a tarantula, it's not going to hurt. If nothing else, they have a really big fangs. But the venom itself is not going to be strong enough to kill you. So those are the two that are venomous in the U.S., the black widows and the brown recluse. Within the Chelicerata, we also have the order Acari. These are the mites and ticks. These are the most diverse. We said there are about 35,000 different species of chelicerates. There are even more different kinds of mites and ticks. Many mites and ticks are predators, but there are also many that are parasites. And in fact, the vast majority of mites are so small, you can't see them without a microscope. Just like we saw with the spiders, we have a cephalothorax and an abdomen that's sort of fused together, so it looks like it's an unsegmented body plate. If you look at a tick, you look at a mite, it looks like they don't have any segmentation, but it's because these body parts have been fused together. Basically, ticks and mites are very similar to each other. The primary difference is that ticks are larger. Physiologically, they're very similar. Biologically, they're very similar. Behaviorally, they're very similar. Morphologically, they're very similar. The primary difference is that we can see ticks very easily. All ticks are bloodsuckers. They exclusively feed on blood within as they're growing. Not necessarily human or mammal blood, but they're all feeding on blood. And the Acari are capable of carrying many diseases. So in terms of impact on humans, yeah, ticks and mites might be annoying. Anyone here have dust allergies? When you start dusting, you start sneezing a lot or something? Anyone know what that's from? Dust mites. Dust mites, what is dust? Dust is basically primarily consists of skin cells that are dead, that is sort of flaked off. The dust mites use this as a food source. They're eating these dead skin cells. Now, are you allergic to dust mites? No. Anyone want to guess what you're actually allergic to? Not the dead skin.
They're the secretions?
They're secretions. Dust mite feces is what causes people to sneeze. So as they're eating, the dust mites are defecating, secreting their feces, and people dust, that gets up in the air. That's what people who are allergic to dust are actually sneezing. So, examples of tick-borne diseases would include Rocky Mountain spotted fever and Lyme disease. We have Rocky Mountain spotted fever down here, occasional Lyme disease, but not very much. So now we move on to a new class called the crustacean. These are primarily marine. There are a few freshwater specimens, but the vast majority of crustaceans live in the marine environment. As I mentioned, these include the ones that are good to eat. Crabs, shrimp, lobsters. You don't really eat barnacles too much or crayfish. You can eat crayfish, I guess, if you're from Louisiana. But these are all of these primarily marine crustaceans. Just like we saw with the Chelicera, the head is and the thorax have fused together, and it's referred to as the cephalothorax. All crustaceans have two pairs of antennae. This is one thing that separates them from insects. Insects only have one pair of antennae. All crustaceans have three pairs of modified appendages that are used for feeding. So I mentioned that the mouth parts are modified for feeding. The number of legs that crustaceans have varies based on the species that we're talking about. All the Chelicera have 4 pairs of legs. Crustaceans can have multiple legs up to 71 pairs, 142 legs altogether. Crustaceans, because they're entirely aquatic, mostly marine, they have gills. Most of them have gills that exchange for gas exchange. The really, really small ones exchange gas directly through their cuticle. So this is sort of the generalized crustacean. This is one that everyone should recognize. We have the cephalothorax region, which is the head and the thorax that are fused together. Then we have the abdominal region, so it's split into 2 body parts. And as we said, in the abdomen, you can usually see distinct segmentation. 2 pairs of antennae, multiple legs that are used for feeding, and then multiple legs including swimmerets. So in this example with the lobster, you have walking legs, but the swimmerets are also the legs that are part of the modified appendages. And then lastly, you have the gill structure as well. The third class are the class Hexapoda. These are the insects, by far the largest group, not only of arthropods, but of animals altogether. They're the largest both in terms of the number of species and also the largest just in terms of biomass, the number of individuals. More than half of all named animals are insects. There are approximately 1 billion insects alive at any given time. That's 10 to the 18. So just in terms of the pure biomass out there, insects are the most dominant life form on this planet. Ants by themselves, just ants, comprise of about 25% of all biomass on the planet. So if you take all living material, not just animals, not animals and plants, everything that is considered alive, 1/4 of that are going to be ants. So again, if you sort of look at this, you can see that of the arthropods, the insects are the most dominant. There are more beetles than there are any other kind of arthropod. Now, within the insects, there's lots of different orders. You have things like the Lepidoptera. These are the ones that everyone likes. Butterflies, moths, that sort of thing. The Homoptera, which are usually plant-feeding insects. Coleoptera, which are the beetles. The Diptera, these are the ones people usually don't like. These are the flies. Orthoptera, which are oftentimes pest species. Isoptera, which are things like termites. So there's a lot of different kinds of insects out there. These are all characterized by similar features. All insects have the body that's divided into 3 segments. You have a head region, you have a thorax region. The thorax itself is broken down into 3 different units, and each unit on the thorax has a pair of legs. So how many pairs of legs do insects have?
6
pairs of legs? 3 pairs of legs. 3 segments on the thorax, each one has a pair of legs. Now, many insects also have wings. The Diptera have 1 pair of wings, other orders have 2 pairs of wings. These are actually not appendages. These are not modified appendages. They're modified exoskeleton. They're consist of outgrowths from the exoskeleton, from the body wall, that has now been modified to enable flight. And then lastly, you have the abdomen, which is usually broken down into different subsections. Most of the insects out there have the compound eyes that we were talking about. The mouth parts of insects are all modified leg structures, modified appendages. Overall, they have the similar basic structure. You have mandibles, you have maxillary palates, you have upper and lower labia. But there's going to be specific modifications based on what they're feeding. Because they're so diverse, there's a huge diversity in terms of insect feeding types. You have things like mosquitoes that have a piercing mouth part, because what do? They pierce into tissue to get blood. You have butterflies. Basically, their mouth part is almost like a big long straw because they're sucking juices and fluids from plants. You have flies. Their mouth parts are basically modified sponges because they're sort of absorbing material that has been digested externally. So the mouth parts of insects are modified based on their feeding habits. Now, internal organization, we have a tube in a tube structure. I've mentioned this a few times. So the digestive tube is basically going to be this tube extended through the entire body. They do have a stomach that's referred to as a midgut. This is where digestion takes place. They have excretory systems that are referred to as Malpighian tubules. This is where waste is removed from the bloodstream, from the hemolymph, and then is excreted through the anus. Now, there are some parasitic forms of insects. There are some aquatic forms. They do have spiracles, but because of where they live, the spiracles are going to be permanently closed. The terrestrial insects, the spiracles can open and close. Now, one thing that is unique to insects among all the arthropods is that they undergo a process that's called metamorphosis. It refers to a life change. It's a change from when an insect is an immature to becoming a mature insect. So there are two kinds of metamorphosis. One of these is referred to as simple metamorphosis or homometabolis. So if an insect is homometabolous, it undergoes simple metamorphosis. In these kinds of insects, the immature stage is very similar to the adult stage. They look very similar. Can anyone name an insect that goes through simple metamorphosis? Does a caterpillar look like a butterfly?
No. Fly?
Fly? Nope, they actually have a very, they are not simple. Grasshoppers are an example of one that's a simple metamorphosis. You look at a young baby grasshopper, it basically looks exactly the same as an adult. The only difference is size. The other metamorphosis is complete metamorphosis, referred to as holometabolism. With these, the immature larvae looks very different from the adult. Often it may look worm-like. So when we talk about a fly, the immature is something like a maggot. When we talk about a butterfly, the immature is a caterpillar. So the immature organism is still an insect, it's still a fly or a caterpillar, but it looks very different from the adult. Usually with these, with the ones that undergo holometabolism metamorphosis, there's some sort of resting stage, a pupal stage, where the body literally reorganizes itself. You have the immature insect growing, it then enters this pupal stage. In caterpillars, it's referred to as the chrysalis. And basically what then happens is the body dissolves inside. There's a rearrangement of cells. If you break open a pupa, it's not going to look like an insect. It may just look like goo, because the body is rearranging itself at a cellular level to become the mature adult stage, and once it breaks out, then it is the mature adult. The fourth class of arthropods are the Myriapoda. These are the centipedes, which are the Chilopoda. They're recognized by having one pair of legs on each body segment. So if you think about centipedes, they're long and thin. Every single body segment is going to have a pair of legs. They don't actually have 100 legs. The number varies based on the species. All centipedes are carnivorous, and all centipedes have venom that they secrete, and that they can bite and in many cases be lethal to humans. The other lineage are the millipedes, the subclass Diplopoda. These are different from the centipedes. Every body segment has two pairs of legs. They don't actually have 1 million legs. So you can look at the body segments of centipedes or millipedes and recognize it by looking at how many legs each one has. All millipedes are herbivores. So the centipedes are carnivores, the millipedes are herbivores. Now millipedes, they don't have a venom. Some millipedes have evolved a defense mechanism where they can produce basically a bad-smelling fluid, chemical warfare, when they're being attacked. If you start picking them up and handling them, all of a sudden your hands start stinking because they're releasing this secretion to try and deter predation. So here we see the legs. Which one of these is the centipede? If you look at those, aside from the name, if you look at those body segments, there's one pair of legs on each body segment. With the millipedes, you have 2 pairs of legs on each body segment. So that's how you can recognize them. Then you see very distinct body segmentation. There's a very clear head region. There is no thorax. It's all remaining just individual segments. And the millipedes, like many of the other organisms, are gonochoric. There's males and females. However, these engage in internal fertilization. The females then lay eggs that are ready to hatch. The way millipedes grow, the way centipedes grow, as they increase in size, they're basically just adding additional segments. So the longer a millipede or centipede you see, the older it's going to be. Pull out your clickers for a second. This is an example of a coelomated invertebrate that I haven't talked about. These are tardigrades. They're very small, microscopic animals. They're usually abundant in algae, in moss, oftentimes in beach and aquatic areas. They have segmented body plans. They have sac-like, unjointed limbs, and they grow by molting. Based on those characteristics, who would you say they're related to? Arthropods, annelids, mollusks, or nematodes? Think about those characteristics and tell me what your answer is. Talk it over with your neighbor.
They have segmented bodies, yeah, see? They have segmented bodies, sac-like, unjointed limbs, but they grow by molting. Insects grow by molting.
Well, did you get the grade off?
Yeah. And what else? And segment. It's not a mollusk. It's not a nematode. It's either I don't know, like that's the only thing. But see, molting and segments, that's basically the 2 big ones. I mean, just because they're unjointed doesn't mean it's not like those are nematode. But not unjointed. Because mollusks don't move. Nematodes don't move. I don't know that one.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
That means they have a tight sexual relationship. Well, not necessarily.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, yeah. It's kind of beyond your attention.
Need more time?
Slow bit, please.
Tough question. This is how phylogenies used to work. Just look at characteristics, try and see what the similarities were, and put them based on these physiological and morphological similarities.
The only thing that's getting me is the unjointed limbs. That's the only thing that's bothering me. Honestly, it looks like a knife, so I'm calling it an alpha. Yeah, so, yeah. Segmented body. But see, annelids also have segmented bodies. I think.
But the majority of it is majority of its characteristics.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. I don't think molting is a nematode. I don't think molting is I don't think it's shed.
I don't remember.
They shed.
I think.
Oh,
I know that's
they're like one.
But I don't think jointed is it? You said jointedness was like one of the major.
I'll put it. Yeah, it says they have segmented bodies and sac-like.
30-second clock.
So you want to pick out?
Yeah. Can I pick that?
Hanging out with them.
It's like one of like.
I pick arthropod because of the molting. Arthropod. Because of the molting.
Yeah.
10 seconds. Put your answers in.
I think I already put it. 6.
Okay, I'll pick.
Let's see what everyone said.
Yes.
All right, so it looks like most people are saying arthropods.
I got it in just
The annelids were the second most. A few people said each of the others. The mollusks and the nematodes. So how do we go about doing this? Well, I gave you three characteristics, right?
Yeah.
I gave you the fact that they have segmented bodies, the fact that they have unjointed limbs, and the fact that they grow by molting. So what we have to do is we have to look at each of those characteristics and say, well, which one does that make it similar to? So let's start with segmented bodies. Of these four, which of those have segmented bodies? Arthropods and annelids. So we have two that have segmented bodies right there. Mollusks do not have segmented bodies. Nematodes do not have segmented bodies. What about sac-like unjointed limbs? Which of those have unjointed limbs? The annelids. We talked about the arthropods being able to do this. That's a joint right there. So in that case, we now have two characteristics that are similar to annelids, one that is similar to arthropods, two that are not similar, and then neither of those are similar to mollusks or nematodes. What about molting? Which ones grow by molting? Arthropods. So we now have two characteristics that are similar to arthropods, two characteristics that are similar to annelids, and then no characteristics that are similar to mollusks or nematodes. So right there, we've gone through these characteristics, and you should be able to say, well, there's nothing that makes them similar to mollusks. There's nothing that makes them similar to nematodes. So you can rule those out. We have two characteristics that make them similar to arthropods, two characteristics that make them similar to annelids. Based on what I've told you here, it's sort of a 50-50 guess unless you start to try and look at what some of these characteristics are. Of these characteristics, segmented body plans, we sort of throw that out because that's the same as both annelids and arthropods. Unjointed limbs versus molting. That's really the key difference that's going on here. Now, do all annelids have limbs? No. Some of them do, and they're unjointed, but some of them do not. So limbs seems to be a variable structure within the annelids. Do all arthropods grow by molting? Yes. Yes, they do. So that's a characteristic that's unique, or that's a characteristic that's common to all arthropods. So we have these two characteristics here. One that's found in some annelids, but not all annelids. One that's found in all arthropods. So you put more weight on the characteristic that's found in every single lineage. You put more weight in the fact that they grow by molting than the fact that they have unjointed limbs. So the correct answer is A. They are more closely related. They are actually a type of arthropod. The process of molting is one of the ways that we recognize arthropods. Having limbs is not a way that we recognize annelids. So yes, these are actually an arthropod that do not have jointed limbs. They lost the jointed limbs. All right. So now we've finished talking about the coelomated invertebrates. Everything else that we're talking about now is going to be deuterostomes. The coelomated invertebrates were protostomes. If we think back to those two different lineages, we're talking about things like radial versus spiral cleavage, termination, and so forth. So all the rest of the animals we refer to are going to be deuterostomes. The deuterostomes are broken down into two different phylums. You have the Echinodermata. I mentioned those. These are things like the sea stars and the sea urchins. These are invertebrates. So they're coelomated, they're invertebrates, but they're deuterostomes, not protostomes. And then you have the chordates, the chordata. These are now the vertebrate mammals, or vertebrate animals. Both of these have a coelom, both of these are in deuterostomes, but only the echinoderms are invertebrates. So before we get started with that, we have two quick animations here. One that will talk about protostomes, which we have been talking about. One that will talk about deuterostomes, which we're going to be talking about.
New molecular evidence is currently reshaping our understanding of evolutionary relationships within the animal kingdom. Organisms with bilateral symmetry, a distinctive head region, and 3 tissue layers are members of a monophyletic group called the Bilateria. The Bilateria were traditionally subdivided into 3 groups based on a morphological trait: the extent of coelom, or body cavity development. Coelomates were further divided into protostomes, lophophorids, and deuterostomes, based on specific events during early development. According to this view, annelids, arthropods, and mollusks belong to the protostome lineage. The recent incorporation of molecular data into the phylogenetic tree has resulted in a major reorganization of the Bilateria. In this phylogeny, protostomes comprise 2 large groups that differ mainly in the way they grow. The Lophotrochozoans grow by increasing their overall body size, whereas the ecdysozoans grow by molting their exoskeletons. These competing phylogenies are hypotheses of ancestry, and the discrepancy between morphological and molecular phylogenies remains to be resolved by further research. The 3 major groups of Lophotrochozoans exhibit very diverse morphologies. The first group consists of relatively simple organisms that lack a true coelom, the platyhelminthes, or flatworms, and the rotifers. Many flatworms are parasitic, whereas rotifers are free-living aquatic animals that rely on cilia for locomotion and feeding. Organisms in the second group of Lophotrochozoans have a coelom and a lophophore, a crown of ciliated tentacles surrounding the mouth that's used in feeding. These organisms are sessile, which means that they remain attached to a substrate for their entire adult life. The third group, which includes the annelids and mollusks, features coelomates that develop into mobile adults. The development of segmentation in the annelids stimulated the evolution of new forms of locomotion. Mollusks have a specialized body plan consisting of a muscular foot, often used for locomotion, a visceral mass containing internal organs, and a mantle that serves as protective covering.
So we'll finish with this on Friday and then also move on to the deuterostomes and any kind of it.